2 times to 6 or 7 times as often as white drivers, depending on the region. And Native Americans were even higher disparities in the areas around the reservations. Wow. So I had done a project early on in my time at the Seattle Times, and when I came to Stanford, I had pitched something called Big Local News. It was really just an idea, but the idea is that there are a lot of local investigations or data journalism projects that could be replicated across domains, across geographic domains, if and then aggregated up for bigger effect. And so this was my pilot project, if you will. I knew it could be done because I had done it in one state. I knew that state patrols collected the data in at least some states. So it was my first assignment to my first data journalism class at Stanford, where I made them put in public records requests, negotiate for the data, and then I ended up with something like, first go around anywhere from, I can't remember, I think I started with like 30 million and then it grew to 60. And Jay Hamilton, who's the chair of our program at Stanford, introduced me to an engineering professor who started the same year that I did, Sharad Goel, associate engineering professor, and he had done a lot of analysis and statistical analysis looking at racial disparities. So when he found out I had data, he was very excited. So we decided to kind of combine our efforts and kind of up the statistical rigor of what we could do, and also really put a lot of journalism to bear behind it as well. So that's what we did. Now we have 250 million records, 33 states, 57 cities, going over about a 10-year period of time. And we, as in more Sharad's team, has built a new statistical test to measure discrimination called the threshold test. And we also used a test called the veil of darkness, that because of just the sheer amount of data that we had, we were actually able to use to look to see if police were stopping Black drivers more than white drivers. It's kind of a hard thing to tell, but we used just what it sounds like, the veil of darkness. We looked at stops after sunset and before sunset on average across a wide geography, and found that on average, yes, African Americans were being stopped. Like the stops of African Americans would drop once the race could no longer be seen.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of the power from this project is being able to put numbers behind what was perhaps anecdotally known in the area, in the community.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way to put it. I mean, it's really putting evidence behind the anecdote, which is often what data journalism is all about.
Right. Now, so did any concrete action or change result from this work? It's great to be able to show the statistics, but and we'll get into this more later, but perhaps in journalism, the goal is to really make sure that people are aware of a problem and then maybe changes are made.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Stanford Open Policing Project really has these kind of two different directions, right? We have very much the academic policy side on Sharad's, and then on my side is very much the journalism side. So we've done both things and we've seen impact in both ways. We've trained about 200 journalists on how to analyze the data using R. So we've leveled up their skill sets. And then we worked with them to make sure that their analysis, to help them troubleshoot any problems, vet their data analysis. And so the LA Times had already been investigating the LAPD, and they'd done a lot of stories. The most recent story happened to be that they used the threshold test and the veil of darkness test, looking at LAPD stops. And then a week later, the LAPD announced that they would no longer do random police stops. So that's a quick policy change that happened because of reporting. That same kind of thing happened in Ohio when a nonprofit journalism organization did a statewide look at stops in Ohio, and we've seen it in other places as well. So that's, and Washington State had stopped funding analysis of the data because they cut it out of their budget during the Great Recession and never added it back in. But Investigate West, which is a nonprofit journalism organization in Seattle, took a look at the disparities with Native Americans, wrote a story using our data and with some feedback from us. And a week later, the Washington State Patrol announced that they would start funding the analysis again and using it for their policing efforts. So that kind of change journalistically we've seen. And then on the policy side, Shara Goel's group actually met with a police department and evaluated whether their kind of ancillary stops, taillight stops, things like that, equipment problem type of stops or swerving out of your lane stops, if those were actually deterring crime, which what the police department thought it was. And in fact, it wasn't. They were able to show that it wasn't. So the police department stopped all of those kinds of stops.
That's pretty incredible. And that's very concrete impact indeed. Now, were any of the results from the project surprising?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the anecdote had been there for a long time.
Right.
So not really. I mean, I guess the one thing that was interesting, well, there's lots of interesting things, but one thing that was making sure that we were really looking at how the data came in. And this happened before we did the work in Texas, but we verified it using the census surname database. But in Texas, the state patrol was mislabeling their stops, and a radio station in Texas, KXAN, and a data journalist with the Austin American Statesman uncovered this because in Texas, the data allows you to go right down to the driver level. So they had the names of the driver, and they tracked, and they had the home addresses, which we have not released, but we have it. And so anyway, they were able to show that out of all of these stops, officers, the state patrol was listing people as white when they were very clearly not white. They were either Hispanic or Black. And so then state law changed after that publication happened because they changed the way that they were collecting the data because it was very clearly being manipulated. And so I guess the interesting thing there was like the patterns, like it didn't match up with everywhere else, right? And that's because there was something wrong with the data.
Interesting. Okay. And this brings us back to the point of using data to help tell stories by either looking for anomalies or looking for trends. And of course, the theme of this conversation is how to build a more just future. So you've been involved in a lot of investigative and public affairs projects outside the Open Policing Project. And you're in fact a former board president for the Investigative Reporters and Editors. So I figured now might be a good time for those who aren't familiar. Can you give us a quick overview of what topics investigative journalists typically report on and what exactly that work entails?
My gosh, well, that's like broad, but everything. I have known investigative reporters to investigate false antiquities. I have, problems with cheating in schools in terms of data journalism, cheating in schools, where the Atlanta Journal-Constitution used tracked erasure marks on tests to be able to prove that there was actually cheating happening, and the erasures were coming from the teachers. So there's a whole slew of things. There's sexual abuse by doctors and doing machine learning on 100,000 documents to sift it down to a reasonable amount that could actually be analyzed. Again, that was the AJC. One great story that was done years ago was an investigation into Native American housing and funding from HUD and how it had been misused. There's a lot of different investigations. Data journalism actually got its start. I don't know, should I continue? You want me to tell you this part or not?
Yeah, of course. I think that'd be perfect for this audience.
Okay. All right. So in 1967, you all may know this, but there were race riots in Detroit. And they called in the National Guard. Hundreds of people were injured. I cannot remember the numbers of deaths, but there were quite a few deaths. And a man named Phil Meyer, who worked for Knight Ridder, which was a chain of newspapers, they owned the Detroit Free Press. He had just finished a fellowship at Harvard where he took social science classes. So it was a year-long mid-career journalism fellowship called a Nieman. And he had spent his year learning how to analyze data, essentially, how to use social science. And back then, so this was in 1967, and he had just finished it. Back then, you used punch cards. You rented a mainframe. It was a laborious process. He had just finished his fellowship. He was back in the DC bureau of the Detroit Free Press and Knight Ridder, and these riots happened. And so the city editor, that's the guy who runs the local news report, so the editor for that breaking news kinds of things, called the bureau and said, we need more bodies. We need some, come and help us. So he literally got in his station wagon with a colleague, and they drove from DC to Detroit. And he spent an entire week out on the streets covering these race riots and fires everywhere and all of this stuff. And then they were sitting around at the end of the week and thinking, what are we going to do next week? Like, what should we write about? Like, this is a huge story. And back then, if the Associated Press or the United Press International, if the wire services sent something, it would come on this big machine and make a big clatter. The bell would ring. It was kind of a thing. And so that happened. He walks over and rips off the story, this piece of paper, like that had just come across the wire. And it was a report about an academic study into the Watts race riots from 1965. And it found, and it dug into whether the rioters were from LA, or not. Were they like from that area, or like, just as we've seen today, were they looters coming from elsewhere to disrupt, or like what was really happening? And so he pulled that off and walked over and he said, well, this took the academics 2 years to do, but we're journalists. We can do it in 2 weeks. And he was close. It took them 3 weeks. They partnered with the Urban Institute. They hired African Americans and trained them to do survey work. They went into the neighborhoods that had had the worst rioting. They did statistically rigorous surveying. They rented a mainframe at the University of Michigan at night, because it's the only time they could get it, fed it all the punch cards. And they basically found that no, people were not coming in from other places to cause havoc. In fact, these were mostly law-abiding citizens who were simply fed up by the way that they had been. The whole riot started because a police officer, a police raid on what's called a blind pig, but basically an illegal bar, and with little provocation, ended up attacking African Americans, and so not so different from today. And so he was able to show that this whole theory about what was behind the riots was not true. And that work won a Pulitzer Prize. So that got the attention of journalists who started trying to use computers to find insights that we might otherwise not. And that's kind of how this all got started. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the recap. And I think that's a fantastic bit of history for those who aren't necessarily super familiar with what even the phrase data journalism means. And I'm also really glad you brought up current events, because yes, we are living in, a time of great flux. Not only has there been a lot of frustration with police-initiated violence, we're seeing that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting communities of color. And then not to mention that there's also issues with algorithmic bias. There's just so much going on. So right. In light of everything that is swirling around right now, what are some areas where you've noticed particularly innovative or interesting data journalism work?
Yeah, so BuzzFeed has done some really interesting work. I can't remember if it's just BuzzFeed or 538 has now done some of it, but they've done some very interesting work where they've looked for the spy planes over the protests. So you can track flights, and if you find flights that are just going in a circle over a place, that's usually a pretty good indication that it's a spy plane. And in this case, it was the FBI illegally surveilling protests in almost every major city where there have been protests. So that's an very innovative way of using data to tell a story and find a story that I think otherwise you couldn't have. So that's one example. I think the work that journalists are doing just to collect the data, vet it, and put it out there for people so that they can understand what's happening, both with the number of cases, the number of fatalities, and testing, is really incredible. It's not particularly it's hard only in the sense that it's just like the data change, the local governments decide they don't want to release it one day, and then the next day they dump a whole pile of it. And so you're always having to make sure that it's working and that you're explaining it well. But that's, that's kind of bread and butter work, but it's really important.
Right. It's been really interesting to see for me how journalists have sort of tried to rise to the occasion and fill in the gaps in terms of aggregating data from a lot of different states or even counties when we're not seeing necessarily a concerted federal effort in that regard. And so coming back to the Open Policing Project, so we actually have one audience question. Bill asked that you mentioned that you would obtain data or public records for 33 states. Where are the big gaps in the data, and are there any trends in terms of parts of the country?
Yeah, let me look really quickly. I want to say that the gaps are not really obvious. Let's see. We have my map on the Stanford Open Policing Project is not as helpful as it used to be because we have city and state data in it. But some southern states don't provide the data, although some of the southern cities will. So, for example, we don't have data from Arkansas State Patrol, but we do have data from Little Rock. California's really good. We have from the State Patrol and now there's state law that the cities are phasing in, so we're getting more and more data from the cities. Colorado, we have data from the State Patrol, but it's somewhat useful. We also have data from Denver and like Aurora, but a lot of the other cities we couldn't get. Louisiana is probably my favorite example of unusual reasons for why they wouldn't give us the data. The actual response to our public records request says that because the state has a policy against racial profiling, they cannot collect the data, which is kind of amazing to me.
That's a really interesting response.
Yeah, Georgia told us they couldn't give us the data because their system was too hard, was too complicated, and they weren't able to release it. And then we found out that they used the exact same system as Florida, which had already given us the data. So we told them that, connected them to the tech person in Florida, and we got the data. Wow. So sometimes it's just figuring out the negotiation that you have to do.
That's really cool. And also I think this would be a great time. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Okay, Montana. I have to. So I'm from Montana, so I have to tell this one. Montana had a court settlement with the ACLU because they had held 2 Hispanic men on the side of the highway for 4 hours. And they were supposed to collect the data, provide it to an academic to analyze and use that data. We asked for the data and they said, they didn't have it anymore because they had given it to the academic. Then we thought that was newsworthy and told them we'd be writing a story for the local paper, and they decided that they might go look for it again. Indeed, they found it.
Wow. Okay. This is so great I think this is really good context. I think that there's this entire side of journalism. Of course, we know that reporting takes a lot of work. It takes, shoe leathers is what we'll say, but there's this component to data, right? And it sounds like data is not necessarily easy to get your hands on. So when, you had earlier mentioned filing requests for public records. So how exactly does that work? For someone who's not doing this on a daily basis, can you tell us a bit about, what goes into requesting public records, what records you can obtain, and in this case for the project, what was sort of the turnaround time in order to get to the millions of records that you currently have?
Yeah, so the way that public records work is there's a federal law, you might have heard of it, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, that just applies to the federal government. It does not apply to courts. Courts are exempt from FOIA, as is Congress. Mm-hmm. It also does not apply to local or state governments. Each state has its own law governing public records, and they vary widely. And some states, you have to live in the state to be able to ask for public records. In other states, there's no right of appeal. So if it's turned down, you have to sue. California is that way. Other states have no time limit in which they have to reply to you by. Montana is that way. Florida is known as the Sunshine State, not just because it's sunny there all the time, but because it's actually got really, really good very robust open records laws, which surprises a lot of people, but it does. So you have to know the state law, and you have to know how to request it. So almost everywhere, a local government does not have to make a record for you. So if you say, hey, can you tell me what the summary statistics are for this data, they don't have to do that because that's making a record. That would involve a query. And so that's like creating a record. But if you say, I want all of your data, then they have to give it to you, generally speaking, as long as as long as it's not private information. And even then, the burden of redaction is usually on the government. They'll tell you that it'll take a lot of time, and they're entitled to charge programming time or time to sift through record pages of stuff. And then you can just tell them, well, just don't give me that column, and it usually solves the problem. But, are the cost estimates that I've gotten over time have ranged from free, completely free, to the cost of a CD to, this will cost $200,000. So usually I've never had to pay that much. I'll put it that way. The most I've ever paid for a data set was probably $4,000 or $5,000. And that is only because I was working on a project for NBC and they were in a hurry. I would have fought it and probably gotten it down.
Okay. So for the Open Policing Project, you've now got these millions of records. How long did it take to get all those records? And you mentioned you're working with students. How many students did it take?
Yeah, so I had 18 students that first year. And then I had 80 students from the University of Maryland in a media law class the second year, plus my own students, another like 14 students. So probably took us a couple of years to really get the first iteration of just the state patrol records. And then we went after city level records. For that iteration, we also added a half-time staff person who kind of helped marshal and shepherd all of the records requests because it was a lot to manage. And really, you kind of have to have somebody who's not just like, students are great, but you need somebody to help manage the effort. Otherwise, it gets lost.
Right. Okay. And we now have an audience question about incorporating data into reporting, into a story.
Sure.
So Rich asks, how much context needs to be provided in reporting statistics, such as reporting whether disproportionate stopping of minority drivers is indeed motivated by race bias or other factors? How do you really work that into a story?
Yeah, it's so important. There's a couple of ways you can do it. One is almost all data journalism projects these days have what we sometimes call a nerd box, but it's a how we did it. It's where we lay out, sometimes it's a long white paper, like that gets really into the weeds, into the statistical analysis and what each thing means. The other thing is I think it's really important for reporters to understand what the terms mean and to explain them to their readers. And so, there's unfortunately a history in journalism of I think, not giving readers credit enough that they are going to understand something if you can just simply lay it out in kind of plain English. So understanding the difference between disparity and bias, for example. I actually, at the beginning of this, I mentioned a racial profiling project. I actually wouldn't use that term in a story, right? I just wouldn't. I mean, that's a shorthand kind of thing, but because you have to really dig into, is there evidence of discrimination? Is there evidence of bias? And how do you figure that out? And so often you need to like you might introduce a topic. It's like this analysis showed X, and then you kind of have to lay it out. That's different from just a mere disparity, right? And this is how it's different, right? Mm-hmm. Given the same circumstances, the officers, consistently treated, had a lower bar for searching a person of color, a driver who's a person of color than a white driver. So like you have to kind of, I think, almost take a step back and do a little explanation for a paragraph or two and then kind of go back into the story.
Right. And it sounds like that's especially crucial when, in the case of the Open Policing Project, you both have these stories that you're creating, but Sharad, who's an academic in STEM, is also developing these novel statistical tests and techniques, which he's publishing on in very academic circles. So I'm curious, this partnership has been very fruitful because it's led to these two parallel results. Looking at these results and based on your experience with Sharad at Stanford, what would you say are the components that go into a successful partnership between people in STEM and people in journalism, how do you make sure that these sorts of partnerships meet the needs of both sides? And yeah, so any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we both had intrinsic motivation, right, and for this particular project. Because Shard really wanted that data so he could build new novel statistical tests. He could really do something like it had a intellectual challenge built into it, right? Being able to look at this data that had not been collected before in this way. So he had a motivation to want to be able to do that. And I had a motivation to see if I could actually collect from many disparate sources and aggregate a massive data set that would be useful for journalists. So we both were motivated to be able to figure out a way to make it work. And I think you have to have that. The thing that journalists have too often done, have like in newsrooms too, and this has shifted a lot, but it is like, oh, you know how to code. Here, can you analyze this for me and find this? No, I can't, right? I can be an equal partner with you and we can like work with each other. If you say this thing is true, I'm going to say, okay, but how do I explain it to my reader, right? Mm-hmm. And can I use this anecdote and does that fit with the pattern as a whole, right? So I'm making sure, like in one of the other, I think, things you have to watch out for is cherry picking, right? And probably everybody's familiar with that, right? You don't want to cherry pick a piece of data that says that then, oh, I'm going to go find that one person who was stopped and they tell this egregious story. Well, if they're not representative of the data as a whole, that should not be the first sentence of my story, right?
Right.
So it's like making sure that you're responsible about how you do all of that is really, really important, and making sure you can put it into plain English. So take it from that academic language and bring it to a place where you can explain it to just the regular everyday person.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Rich has another question. So, and this dovetails.
I like you, Rich.
Into what you were just talking about, which is, do you see data journalism as a way towards achieving more objective reporting and helping to remove bias, with hard data being less open to interpretation?
Yeah, so objective is hard. I would say you're never truly objective. I think that's just hard. But I do think you can be independent, right? This is not a data journalism thing, but I'll just give you an example of what I mean, a very basic example. I recently read a story in the San Francisco Chronicle, which really upset me, because it was a travel writer who wrote about flying to Palm Springs and then disclosed in the story, at least it was disclosed, that he was doing this on Alaska's dime. And so it was a fairly upbeat story about air travel. But you know what? They took the ticket and it was a first class ticket. So they're already biased and they're already, I think, compromised. So the more you can be independent of those kinds of influences, the better reporting that you can do. And then I think the more you disclose kind of possible biases is also good. But yeah, I just don't think you can be truly objective, but you can use, I do believe you can use data and kind of like lay out the steps to, well, this is why we think this is happening. And this is why we think there's evidence of discrimination. This, here, we actually looked at all of these data points, all of these stops, and this is what it shows, right? Right. That I think that kind of at least put some of that evidence behind those anecdotes. And so it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's not so unfamiliar to people who've been trained in the scientific method, where it's you need to consider carefully. You need to be, this is sort of disclosure. You need to be transparent about what your assumptions are, what your studies you've done, or like what the scope of your experiment and what you found. And of course, for various reasons, journalism now has been saddled with this responsibility of objectivity. But it sounds like what you're saying is that rather than striving for objectivity, we should be striving for, or data journalism can help sort of, it's like truthfulness versus objectivity. It's like being transparent about what we do know and what we can say.
Irina, you'll know this phrase that I often teach in my classes, and that is the "to be sure" paragraph, right? So every project has its caveats. Every complicated data analysis has its caveats. And I think it's critical that journalists put those caveats up high, very high in their story, and at least like addresses them, and maybe even then later in the story has a whole section that says, well, here are the caveats, and then like here's how we treated that caveat. Here's why we think it's just a caveat and not a whole flaw, like a major flaw in the whole analysis or something like that. And so that's what I and other journalists sometimes call a to be sure paragraph. To be sure, the data is missing this and this and this, but we also think that these findings are true because of X and Y, whatever.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what's next for the Open Policing Project?
Well, we're going to just we've kind of done 2 rounds of training journalists. A lot of journalists are using the data, which is great. We'll continue to update the police stop data, but now we're collecting other data, part of a California reporting project, and an effort with Barry Scheck from the Innocence Project and the ACLU, where we're collecting police disciplinary records. So we're part of this reporting effort across California to pull in, which is now public record in California, police disciplinary records. We're working in New York with the newly opened up police disciplinary record effort there. And the idea is that we will pull in these documents, mostly very messy documents, and build a system that allows us to structure that information so that we can have a really robust, structured data set of police discipline cases, and track what's happened to those officers and how different departments have managed discipline. And I think that's, and we're also hoping to work with public defender offices so that they will kind of keep that up to date as we move along. And then all of that data can pipe into Big Local News, which will then eventually be provided to journalists for analysis for stories on one level and to the public on another level.
Okay. And what does it look like? What does the to the public release look like?
Very much structured, limited data set, but enough so that you can kind of track an officer and over time or over departments or things like that. And the reason it would be structured and limited is because a lot of those disciplinary records, even though they are public, the police departments do a terrible job of redacting private information. So you might have very troubling details related to sexual assaults or things like that. So we want to make sure that kind of information is kept, not in the public domain.
Absolutely. And it sounds like it's sort of a way where you can link from your story and say, like, if you want to explore the data that we based our analysis on, go ahead and check out this link, but it still needs to be sort of sanitized and cleaned for public viewing. Right. So relatedly, actually, new question from Bill. So he asked, one of the things that's been interesting about COVID is how public and actually easy to analyze the data sets have been. And so that has allowed people, including MIT alums, to do their own analysis. The data that you're hosting on Big Local News, you've mentioned that's for journalists, but how easy or hard is it to deal with your data? And especially once you have this public option, do you anticipate other parties being able to explore the data themselves?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I know you all know this. All data is dirty data. So we have about 36 COVID-related data sets in Big Local News right now. And those are open projects available to all journalists who use the platform. But we've archived one of those so far, and we'll continue to archive. And what that means is it goes into the Stanford Digital Repository, and then anybody from the public to academic researchers, really anybody can access that through SearchWorks and through our website on our archive tab, so that you can just download. It's a persistent URL, and you can download the data. You can download the metadata. You can download, like all the links to the stories. All of that is available, and that's the idea. Is that another piece of why I wanted to do Big Local News is that data journalism gets lost to time. You work on a data project, and then you go off to another news organization, and then that data gets, they move a server, they trash a computer, it's gone, and then you can't retrieve it. And so the idea is that as we collect this information, newsrooms can archive it in this digital repository, and it will be there forever. So you can always go back and look at it, and then you can use that historical data for other analyses.
Makes a lot of sense. And the present will one day become history, but there's still a lot going on right now. So this question from Dan about current events is, have you had a chance to review the data collection and reporting requirements in the police reform legislation that is currently being proposed in Congress? I guess sort of like zooming out is, how long does it take for some sort of current event going on to percolate into the local news and for a new data initiative to begin with your team?
Yeah, I mean, I have not looked really in detail in the legislation in Congress, mostly because I'm doubtful as to what will actually be passed at the moment. I'm hopeful in the longer run, but in general, the federal open records law, the FOIA Act, is hard to get data. It's just hard to get data from the federal government. Typically, you ask from any agency, and it will take at least a year. I've waited as long as 4 years for data. I actually did an investigation into airport security not too long, I don't remember when it was, but a while back, when it was not that long after 9/11, and people were very concerned about airport security. And I was able to get through the Office of Personnel Management the data set of all of the TSA screeners. This is through an organization called TRAC, Transactional Record Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University. They collected all of this. And I pulled it down, and I got all of the TSA screeners, their name, when they started, what airport they worked at, which was at the county level. So all it did was say what county they worked at. But there's only one big airport in the county ever. So I was able to do that and then match that to personal identifying, personal information, so that I could find phone numbers. We could call them and do structured interviews and really find out what was going on with airport security. So it was an important project. And then after we published the stories, in the middle of publishing the stories, the TSA tried to get us to stop us from calling screeners. They called us and, tried to tell us we couldn't, but we could. And then after we published the story, despite the fact that they promised to change, the other thing that they did was that they exempted TSA screeners from the databases for security reasons.
Wow.
So, that's the kind of way the federal government typically works. And if you think it will change, if the political party changes, it won't. I mean, Obama had one of the worst records with public records of almost any president. George W. Bush was far better.
So it sounds like, this is why a project like Big Local News it sounds like this is why you launch a project like Big Local News, because it's generally hard to get data to try to do investigations into necessarily federal level stuff, but we can sort of start locally. We can collect data on a local level. We can aggregate that and look for trends, maybe countywide, statewide, and then go from there. Is that,
Yep.
Does that sound like why? Okay.
That's exactly right. You got it.
Great. Cool. And I think this is really, really useful, because I feel like in a lot of, as a casual consumer of journalism, it's really easy to be wrapped up in, national politics or national legislation. But of course, local legislation, local policies matter a lot. And perhaps that's where most of the change starts.
There have really been some great stories done, data journalism stories done, taking a look at the cookie cutter language for state level legislation, where you see the same legislation being introduced in every state legislature, and it's pushed by particular political groups, and you can see that. And the same thing happened with the FCC, where there was a lot of cookie cutter complaints being put in, and so you can do all kinds of things with just showing how governmental bodies are managed, I guess.
Right. So let's see, another question. Okay, so Kay Robinson asks, it seems like data journalism often runs into these nonsense reasons that data isn't accessible. All the excuses, like Georgia saying it's too hard, Louisa saying we can't do this because, we have this policy against racial bias. With Georgia, they had success you had success calling this bluff. What are some other similar success stories where you've been able to cut through the nonsense and say, nope, the data is, legally our right to access?
Most of the time I get the data. I mean, sometimes it takes time. In Seattle, at the Seattle Times, we had a history of suing. And so because of that, and when we did sue, we actually funded a couple of reporter positions on our investigations team from the money we got back from suing the state, because they would withhold data and say that there was some reason that they couldn't give it to us, and we usually got it. There have been, yeah, so it just kind of depends. But generally, there are tried and true answers to, like, you know what roadblocks are going to throw up. You kind of know, okay, we got to make sure they're not creating a record. We have to make sure we're asking for the underlying data. We have to go through the person who doesn't understand what asking for data means, because they'll write you back and say, well, it'll take a clerk 3 weeks to page through every page. And you're like, yeah, that's not what we're asking for. And it's, sometimes they're very well meaning, like they just don't know. Like they're not somebody who works with data. They don't even use a spreadsheet, right? And so you have to say, like, maybe I should talk to the, could I talk to the person who's, we had this saying, like, talk to Fred in the basement, because it used to be that all the IT people were stuck in the basement. They were in the windowless room. They were usually happy to talk to anybody because nobody knew their language. Like, so you find Fred or Jane or somebody, but the person who knows how to code, the person who knows how to program, the person who's managing all of that. So, and you have to kind of work your way around that. There's, yeah. And if all else fails, I find personally that saying, well, like, that's really interesting that your system can't give me that data. How do you do reports to measure your own progress? And then they kind of realize that this is not going to look good, right? Oh, well, our system can't handle that. Our system can't export, information. Wait, your system, well, when did you get that system? Really? And that was, like, who was your contractor? And how do you manage if you can't export a report out? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking to a reporter. That's not going to look good. Okay, I guess I'll give them the data. So
it sounds like actually getting the data to do the science and analysis actually requires, it's almost an art, right? Like you have to,
yeah, it is.
Have to talk to these PIOs. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think this is also really interesting because it highlights, in a story, you might read a one-line statistic, but it turns out there are hours and days worth of negotiation that go into getting basic statistics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, most data journalism, a lot of it is just descriptive statistics. They were seeing more computationally sophisticated things, but a lot of it is just, really basics.
Right. Stuff. So speaking of change and, this whole idea of a more just future, Rich, who says, glad you like my questions, asks again, how are findings from the reporting project, especially the Open Policing Project, how are those findings getting disseminated to policymakers so that meaningful change can happen? You've mentioned an LA Times article, but there's always concern that policymakers are staying within their own news bubbles. So what's sort of the policy side of things?
Yeah, so on Shard Goel's side with the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, they do a lot of work with agencies. And so that's where I want, as a journalist, I want to be independent from that. I tend to not really get involved with that so much. So with the exception being where we're trying to pull in this police disciplinary information. But even then, the journalists involved are not doing anything. I'm the only one who's like kind of connecting. But Shard's group, they meet with police departments. They do work for police departments in terms of analyzing the data that they have to make solutions, suggestions for how they could, handle their policing patterns differently. They've worked with all kinds of issues in terms of analyzing algorithms, looking at bail issues, working with the DA in a variety of cities. So they're getting that's kind of like their piece of it. And I think that works pretty well to kind of twin it. But I also think that, and I could be wrong, but I think Shard would say that he might have been not expecting that journalism actually can get just as much policy change as those other methods. So when you see, and policy change can be really, really fast with journalism, I think, and sometimes a little less fast when you're working from within, although maybe it's longer lasting. I haven't studied that.
Well, it's a good thing that the Open Policing Project is working on both fronts. So Karen asked about funding models. So we've talked a lot about how specifically investigative and journalism and data-driven journalism has changed with the help of computers and more computational techniques. But at the same time, the landscape of journalism is changing as well. Funding has changed a lot in the last 20 years. So when it comes to data-driven computational journalism, what are some of the more promising models that you've seen?
If you want to write a check, it's to big local news.
Support local journalism.
Yeah, funding models are hard right now. However, I'm going to pitch a book, which is sitting right here, which is a really good book, Democracy's Detectives by Jay Hamilton. And what he does is he makes the case that investigative journalism actually fosters more subscriptions. In part, that's one, like it fosters more impact, and it can actually foster more interest from readers. And I think that that's true. I mean, from my period of time, the Seattle Times is a family-owned newspaper. It's very independent. We did a project, actually it was right before I got there, but the investigations editor did this project on this guy who was the Millennium Bomber. He tried to blow up the Space Needle right before 2000, on the New Year's Eve 2000, when it was Y2K. And so they caught him on a ferry with a trunk full of explosives. And his last name was Rassam. I can't remember his first name. And so we ended up doing a big investigation into how this happened and how they caught him and the whole thing and his whole life history, and very, very deep dive. Very much shoe leather, not a lot of data analysis, but shoe leather investigative reporting. And then they broke it up into a series, into like chapters, and they did 22 chapters, relatively short chapters. And so they ran each chapter for 22 days, and the Seattle Times circulation increased just for those 22 days by over 10%.
Wow.
Because it pulled people in, and it had impact, and it had reach, and there was a reason to read it. And so I really think that if we put, we have to figure out how to help fund local journalism. We are seeing more nonprofit models. I mean, Big Local News is a nonprofit, so that's through Stanford. But so a lot of newsrooms are having, like, the investigations team has nonprofit components at the Seattle Times, because that's the only way they can fund their investigations. And so people can give to the education lab or the homeless lab or the things where they're going to, or the investigations team itself, and they don't have any say in what investigations are covered. But they can give to those things. They have created nonprofit funds. The Salt Lake Tribune has gone completely nonprofit. That helps, but we have to figure out how to fund journalism. And right now it's failing. It's just failing. The layoffs are crazy because of COVID right now.
Right.
So
it sounds like there are not yet any easy answers, and at the very least, we can start by supporting local.
Yeah. I mean, okay. I will say, one of the reasons we created Big Local News was to lower the cost of doing accountability journalism. If we're going out and getting this data, or helping local journalists get this data, and then bringing it in and processing it and making it easier to access, and making it easier to analyze the data through tools, or to use an algorithm to create, to be able to categorize information so that you don't have to type in your category. If we can make it easier for journalists to do that kind of work, then that will help. And so that's really important. And I think that's why, what we're doing will help make a difference. So.
Right. Great. So we have about 6 more minutes, but I think now would be a good time. Oh, wait, I think we have one more question. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Toby asks, what are your thoughts on citizen journalism? Given that we're talking about data, a lot of which is either public, which you had to request, but you're also very much a proponent of the sort of sharing data and open data. So what are your thoughts on citizen journalism, like First Amendment auditors? Do you find it helpful to the field or the industry?
What was the part about auditors? I missed that part.
Toby referenced a citizen journalism group, I believe, called the First Amendment Auditors. I'm not personally familiar with this.
I'm not familiar with that either, so that's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. Citizen journalism can be useful, but it also can be very haphazard, right? And you don't know the motivations of the people, of the citizens who are embarking on the journalism. So you want to make sure that they don't have a conflict of interest. So just throwing out things just wide open without any kind of vetting, I think can be problematic. At the same time, it can also be very, very useful as long as you're vetting the findings, right? And fact checking the findings, then it can be useful. One of the most famous examples of citizen journalism is when the Guardian got the expenses for the members of parliament. And I mean, I think they sued, but anyway, they got all of these, like they had not been public forever. And they got all of these expenses for the MPs, way more than they could go through. And it was all in PDF, of course. And governments love to give out data and information in PDF. So they threw it up into a repository. They opened it up and they basically said to, anybody, please go through these documents and send us there was a little, hey, we found something note that you could type in, and it would send a form. You fill out the form and it would go to the editor and say, hey, this so-and-so has this, wacky expense and you should check into it. It seems like it's fraud or whatever. And so they actually found all kinds of stories just by letting everyday citizens go through all of those documents and weigh in on stuff that, didn't pass the smell test. So, I mean, I think there are use cases for it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, there's a lot of tension right now with social media and everything that's coming down the pike. But it sounds like the bottom line is being able to verify first your sources. And then secondly, maybe even being able to harness this power of crowdsourcing. Makes a lot of sense. Great. Okay. So I think we should start wrapping this up. And I'm going to reserve the last question for myself, but we've got a pretty mixed audience here. MIT is, a lot of the focus tends to be on STEM. I mean, I was an electrical engineering major myself, so we've got a lot of science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And sometimes it can be a little difficult to necessarily switch gears from heavily quantitative topics or work to social issues, but they are clearly unavoidable and, a part of everyone's life. So I'm curious, what would you say, given your experience in journalism, what would you say that we can do, not just as responsible citizens, but also as people who have highly specialized expertise in technical fields, who have highly specific training? What can we do to contribute to a more just future?
Well, because I don't know, all of your professions, and you should just all become data journalists. That would be great. But I would say support local journalism wherever and however you can. I will tell you that at the very local level, if any of you are in the academic fields, sometimes local journalists are doing an analysis and they're not exactly sure if they've got it right. They often need to seek out experts to just vet. Did I do this right? Could you just look at my code? I mean, and we do some of that, and Open News does some of that, which is another nonprofit, and with senior data journalists kind of helping, and that was a big part of what the Stanford Open Policing Project did, where we just kind of held hands with the journalists and said, yes, that's the right, you wrote it right. Yep, that finding that you just put into sentence form is accurate, right? They just wanted to make sure they didn't have it wrong. And so since you have a deeper level of knowledge, the more you can engage with local newsrooms and offer up even just a kind of a critical yet supportive eye, because nobody wants to have a correction in the paper. That is on their online site. That's actually very, very useful. There are all kinds of efforts where there is some level of crowdsourcing going on that you need some level of expertise, technical expertise. The ProPublica has quite a few. They are pulling in like precinct level voting results. They have to do that precinct by precinct every year. They have to do they're doing all kinds of things with kind of looking at PDFs to pull in and accurately update information and trying to figure out the best way to do that. There's a lot of efforts like that. So if you're interested in things like that, I'd be happy to put you in touch with folks working on those kinds of efforts. But yeah, sorry.
Great, no worries. We're at the top of the hour. So yeah, so just to wrap it up, it sounds like stay informed, stay engaged, try to get involved where we can,
Yep.
where there's a call for engagement, and hopefully we will all be living in a better future together soon.
We can hope. Yeah.
All right. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for your time. This was really great. And yeah, I think that it was just really fun to hear this crossover between data and storytelling. So thank you.
Bet. My pleasure.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.